Good afternoon, everyone. Before I introduce our distinguished visitor today, Senator John Mitchell, I would like to acknowledge two other very special friends who are here today from Dublin, Ireland. All of us, from time to time, encounter very special people who stand out in our memories and affections. Martin and Carmel Naughton are two such people. In the Republic of Ireland and in Northern Ireland, the Naughtons are remarkable for their leadership in business, in the arts, in education, and philanthropy, and in their overall commitment to Ireland as a people and a nation. Martin is the CEO of Glen Dimplex, the largest maker of electrical heaters in the world, a business that he started from scratch. He has done much to promote peace by expanding economic ties between the Republic and Northern Ireland. Carmel is the former chair of the board of the National Gallery of Ireland. The Naughtons have been among the most generous benefactors of the arts, both in Dublin and Belfast. Martin and Carmel Naughton. Last spring, we launched the Leadership Project. It's an initiative designed to engage the Wake Forest community with leaders of note, to learn about their stories, and to see what can young people learn from leaders and their pilgrimage to that. These individuals will represent a broad range of professional paths, span a range of age groups, and embrace diverse worldviews. This evening, I'll have a conversation with Senator Mitchell, exploring his varied journey, and then we'll turn the floor over to you for your questions. Senator George Mitchell has had a distinguished career in public service. Prior to representing the state of Maine in Congress for 15 years, he was an officer in the U.S. Army Counterintelligence Corps, a trial lawyer with the Justice Department, a U.S. attorney, and a federal judge. He was elected to the Senate in 1980. He left in 1995 holding the position of the Senate Majority Leader. And for a number of years, he was regularly voted the most respected member of the Senate by a bipartisan group. While in the Senate, he served on the Finance, Veteran Affairs, and Environment and Public Works committees. He was part of passing major legislation, including the Clean Air Act and the American with Disabilities Act. He was a leader in opening markets to trade and led the Senate to ratification of the North American Free Trade Agreement. After his time in the Senate, he held a variety of other positions where he was asked to be a voice and broker of peace. As a special U.S. envoy for Middle East peace, he was asked to chair an international fact-finding committee on violence in the Middle East, and the Mitchell Report was published in 2001. In probably his most famous role, Senator Mitchell was special advisor to President Clinton on Ireland. He became chairman of the International Commission on Disarmament in Northern Ireland, and then chairman of the subsequent peace negotiations. After several years of painstaking negotiations, he presided over the Good Friday Agreement in 1998, and this notable accord ended decades of conflict in Northern Ireland. For his work, Senator Mitchell received the Presidential Medal of Freedom. It's also worthy to note that he has served as Chancellor of the Queen's University, Belfast. Senator Mitchell has also had extensive experience in American sports. In 2006 and 2007, he led the investigation into the use of performance-enhancing drugs in Major League Baseball, and currently he works with the NCAA and the Big Ten Conference as the Athletic Integrity Monitor at Penn State University. Please help me in welcoming the Honorable Senator George J. Mitchell. Welcome.
Thank you.
We're honored to have you at Wake Forest.
Yes, thank you very much for that very generous introduction. I speak often And so for me, the highlight of the day is the introduction. And that very generous one reminds me of a story. When I returned from my service in Northern Ireland, I wrote a book about my experience there. And when the book was published, I traveled all across the country on a book promotion tour. I received many, many invitations, and I was surprised to learn that in the United States, there are more Irish American organizations than there are Irish Americans. And every one of them invited me to come and speak to their group. I couldn't go to them all, but I went to several. And as I traveled around the country, they developed among these Irish American groups an informal competition as to who could give the longest, most fantasy-filled, often absurd introductions of me. The proper reaction, of course, would have been to show some humility, to urge them to keep it short. I had an improper reaction. I encouraged them. One guy spent 35 minutes describing everything in my history, including many facts of which I had previously not been aware. And when he finished, I scolded him because he left out that I had received the Science Award when I graduated from high school in Maine. So when I got to the last stop, the Stamford, Connecticut Irish American Society, I was very impressed with myself and feeling very important. When I got in the front door, the first person I encountered was an elderly one who rushed up to me, very excited, shook my hand vigorously, and said, I don't live anywhere near here. I drove 3.5 hours just because I wanted to meet you. You're such a great man. You've done so many great things all around the world. Would you please sign my poster? So she handed me a poster with a big photograph on it. I looked at it. I said, I'll be very happy to sign your poster. But before I do this, something I must tell you. She said, what is it? I said, I'm not Henry Kissinger. She looked at me, she said, you're not? She said, well, who are you anyway? And when I told her, she said, well, that's terrible. She said, I drove 3.5 hours to meet a great man named Kissinger, and all I've got is a nobody like you. I said, well, I'm sorry you feel so bad. I wish there's something I could do. She thought for a moment, and she leaned forward in a conspiratorial manner. I leaned forward. Our foreheads were touching. She said, nobody will ever know the difference. She said, would you sign Henry Kissinger's name? So I did. And it's hanging somewhere in eastern Connecticut. Now, here's the best part of the story. About 9 months ago, Kissinger and I appeared together at an event like this. There was a moderator, and he and I on two sides in Manhattan. And I thought it'd be a good place to tell that story, which I did. The crowd loved it. Kissinger seemed to like it. And then we went on and had the program, and we were asked questions about events all over the world. When I left, I found myself in the elevator with Henry going down to the ground floor. And he said to me, he said, you know, I've heard you speak often. When you were Senate Majority Leader, I've appeared with you before. He said, I have to tell you, you made the best presentation I've ever heard you make tonight. I said, really? Well, I said, it's very flattering coming from you. I said, was it my answer on China, the Middle East? No, he said, that story you told at the beginning. He said, that was really great. You should tell that all over America. So now I keep a list, and Wake Forest will be on my list. The next time I see him, I said, Henry, here, I've been to Wake Forest and various places to tell him I'm spreading the word about what a great man he is. Yeah. But it brought me back down to earth, and I'm very happy to be here with you at Wake Forest.
Senator Mitchell, let me begin with a question about your background. You move in the highest levels of government, business, American life. Yet you were not like the Roosevelts, about whom we've learned a lot recently, born with a silver spoon in your mouth. Could you say something about your background in Waterville, Maine?
My mother was an immigrant from Lebanon. She could not read or write or speak English. she learned it in kind of fractured way through her life, but she worked in a textile mill in Maine all of her adult life, the night shift. My father was the orphan son of immigrants from Ireland. His parents left Ireland just before 1900, and he was born in Boston, but unfortunately never knew his parents. He and his siblings were all placed in orphanages, and so my father grew up in a Catholic orphanage in Boston. After several years there, he was adopted by an elderly couple from Maine who were not Irish, and he did not go to school. He worked and ended his life as a janitor at a local college in my hometown, Colby College. But my parents had as their central goal in life that their children would be educated. So they would have the opportunities that they didn't have. And they had, as many people lacking education do, not only a belief in education, but an exaggerated belief. My father, who never went to school, was, in his mind, if you graduated from college, you were guaranteed a life of financial success and security. It didn't work like that, but that's what he believed. And as a result of their efforts, more importantly, because of the openness of American society, I was lucky, got a lot of help along the way. I worked my way through college full-time. I worked my way through law school full-time. I went work days and went to school in the evening. And all of my brothers and my sister have graduated from college. So although my parents lived and died penniless and without status, they achieved their central goal in life, and I am the beneficiary of their efforts.
You said at one point you were a rather indifferent high school student, and you give great credit to an English teacher named Elvira Whiting.
That's right. That's right. Yes. I was an indifferent student. This is a lot of sports here, so I grew up in a sports-crazy small town, and my three older brothers were very, very prominent athletes. My older brother made all New England. They played. They used to have down here what was called the Dixie Bowl. This is a half century ago. So they played against NC State, UNC, played at the University of Rhode Island. He's a very good athlete. I came along, I was not as good as my brothers. In fact, I was not as good as anybody else's brother. And so I soon became known around our small town as Johnny Mitchell's kid brother, the one who isn't any good. As you might expect, I developed a massive inferiority complex and was insecure. My English teacher in my sophomore year in high school was a woman named Elvira Whitten. She was elderly. She had perfect posture, perfect diction, and she had perfect discipline in her class without once ever raising her voice, because she was such a strong and compassionate personality that every kid in that class, myself included, wanted more than anything in life to impress Mrs. Whitten. About 2 weeks after the school year started in September, she asked me to come into her class after school. And I was worried, thinking I might have done something wrong, but she sat me down and she said to me, "What do you read?" And I understood her, but I instinctively asked, "Well, what do you mean?" She said, "What do you read? Books, magazines, newspapers. What do you read?" I confessed, "I don't read any books other than what's necessary in school." She said, "Well," she said, "I've got a book here for you, and I'd like you to read it and come back and tell me what you think about it." She said, "You don't have to do this, and it will not affect your grade one way or the other." But I wanted to please her, so she handed a book across the table. It was a small book, so small it was not called a novel, but a novella by John Steinbeck called The Moon is Down. It's a fictional account of the Nazi occupation of Norway during the Second World War. I read the whole book that night. I went in the next day. I gave her a book report that unfortunately was longer than the book. And she said, "Well, that's good." She said, "Here's another one called Parnassus on Wheels, a story about a mobile library." That went on for a whole year. I read dozens of books, history, biography, fiction, nonfiction. late in the year, I went in to hand in my book and give her my report. She said, I said, well, what's the next one? She said, you're going to choose the next one. She said, you know enough now to pick your own book. I really was disappointed, and she could see it. She said, but you can still come in and tell me about it. So I literally, this is now I'm a 13-year-old kid, I spent 2 weeks in the public library and the school library trying to find a book to read that I thought would meet Mrs. Witten's standards. I wasn't thinking about myself. I was thinking, because everything I knew was judged by her. I finally settled on the Bounty Trilogy, a series of 3 novels, which many people are familiar with: Mutiny on the Bounty, Men Against the Sea, and Pitcairn's Island. And I read them all. That was the first summer that baseball had any competition. And one of the greatest regrets in my life is that by the time I figured out what a difference Mrs. Witten made in my life and went back to thank her, she had passed away. So what I did, as you know, when I left the Senate, I created a scholarship foundation, which I give out a scholarship to a graduate of every high school in Maine every year. And when we kicked off the program, I tracked down Mrs. Witten's daughter, who had moved away from Maine, and I brought her back so I could tell this story at the opening of my scholarship program in her presence, and through her, thank her mother.
Yeah, what a wonderful story.
Yeah.
When you graduated from college, did you know that you were going to really make something of your life?
No. No, believe me. Believe me, later in life, I traveled around Maine. I spoke at the graduation of every high school in Maine, the only person who's ever done that. And I met thousands of kids who reminded me of myself at their age. Insecure, uncertain, masked with feigned indifference, but a little bit of a spark that somebody else saw. I was lucky enough to go to Bowdoin. I worked full-time, went to college. But the two institutions, the institution beside Bowdoin that made a difference in my life was the United States Army. Well, it's an experience that anybody who hasn't been through it is missing something real in life. The chance to serve your country and at the same time to learn discipline, understand the true meaning of patriotism, not the bumper slogan, but the true meaning of patriotism, teamwork. I felt that I entered Bowdoin an insecure child, and I left the Army as an adult. And it was the combination of the two, Bowdoin and the U.S. Army, that I think, after my parents, made possible what happened later in my life.
After you went to law school, did you assume your life would be in the practice of law?
Yes. And I was working then as an insurance adjuster when I went to law school at night. And when I got my law degree, I'd done very well in law school scholastically. I applied to 15 law firms in Maine. I got 2 interviews and no offers. So for those of you students who get a rejection, don't worry about it. I had 15 of them. My goal in life was to practice law in Maine. I thought that would be really a good life. It's a state of small towns. And I felt a pull back to be with my family, although I'd enjoyed being away. Particularly my military service was in Germany. But I couldn't get a job. And then out of a clear blue sky, I received a letter from the U.S. Department of Justice informing me that I was eligible for a job in the Department of Justice under what they call the Honors Law School Graduate Program. I didn't realize that I was very near the top of my class when I graduated, and I was automatically offered a job with the Justice Department. I took it, but I still wanted to go back to Maine, and 3 years later I was offered a job on the staff of a U.S. Senator from Maine. And I joined it, but I told them I'm only going to do this for 2 years because I really want to go back to Maine and practice law. And then I ended up getting a job and I practiced law. But by the time I got back there, 2 years, I'd got interested in politics. So I then pursued both over time.
Did you assume when you became a judge that that would be your principal course?
Yes. I became a federal judge after serving a tour of duty as a United States Attorney for Maine, and I was 45 years old, and I thought, this is what I'm going to do for the rest of my life. I loved it. It's a great job, tremendous independence, and opportunity to do a lot of good things. And then, to my complete amazement, less than a year later, a vacancy occurred in the Senate, and the governor of Maine called me up and asked if I would accept appointment to the Senate. Let me tell another story. When he called me, it was late at night. He had already announced he was going to have a press conference in the state capitol the next day to announce it. And he said it was me, and I was really surprised because I'd just been a federal judge for a year, and there were a lot of other qualified candidates. So I said, well, I've got to call my brothers, and I've got to talk to my wife. And so I called my three brothers, with whom I've always had this very competitive relationship. So it was ostensibly to seek their advice. But there was a note of triumphalism in my voice. I said, the governor wants to appoint me to the U.S. Senate. What do you guys think about that? Their responses were all negative. My brother Johnny said, nobody can understand how you got to be a federal judge, so you couldn't possibly win an election. You better stay where you are. And after 10 more minutes of insults, I hung up. I called the governor. I said, Governor, I don't need any more time to consider this. I've already received all the reassurance I need of my ability to serve in this position. So I ended up going to the Senate in an appointed position. But that was a high. A year later, before the election, the first public opinion poll was published, which showed that I was behind by 36 percentage points, 61 to 25. That was the low. So life is a series of peaks and valleys and peaks and valleys. You're nice enough to concentrate on the peaks, but I want everybody to know there are a lot of valleys. Yeah. You wake up in the morning and read in the paper that you're 36 points behind and you don't have any chance to win. It's tough to get going that day.
And what was the outcome? By how much?
I won 61 to 39.
Wow.
Yeah. And the next election, I got 81% of the vote.
Yeah.
So I was lucky, and it worked out okay.
There is one position that you turned down, and that was a possible nomination to the Supreme Court under President Clinton. Tell us about that.
Yes.
Why you decided to do that?
In March of my last year, I announced that I would not seek re-election. I wanted to leave when the people of Maine still wanted me to stay, rather than wait until they felt I should leave. I had no opposition. I'd won by 81% the last with 81% the last election. So I thought it would be a good time to leave and to try something else. And so I announced that I was retiring. Just 2 weeks later, Justice Blackmun of the Supreme Court announced that he was leaving the court. So President Clinton, with whom I'd worked quite a bit, called me and said, I want to appoint you to the Supreme Court. I told him I was very flattered. It would be the pinnacle of ambition for a lawyer, and I'd been a district court judge. I said, let me think about it. That was in April. 6 months earlier, I had introduced the President's health care reform bill in the Senate. And I had been engaged in intensive negotiations with other senators, in particular a Republican senator named John Chafee from Rhode Island, who was a close friend of mine. He had introduced the Republican bill. And we thought, maybe I more than he, that we could bridge the differences and pass a health care reform bill that would transform American health care in a way that was badly needed. And so I told the President that after thinking about it, that we have a chance on health care. If I leave, not to sound self-serving, but I was the majority leader and the sponsor of the bill, I said the chances are gone. So I said, you can find plenty of good people to be a Supreme Court judge, but this is a moment of opportunity on health care, so I think I should stay and try that. As it turned out, both Chafee and I were wrong. A few months later, the whole effort fell apart. We couldn't bridge the gaps, and you will recall that. Some of the students won't. It happened in 1994. So I passed up the opportunity. And I've been asked a lot, do I regret it? And the answer is no. You make the best decision you can based on the circumstances that exist at the time, and you live with the consequences. And while you learn from error or mistake or misjudgment, you don't get paralyzed by it. So I haven't thought. Once in a while, when the Supreme Court issued their decision in the Citizens United case, I said, I wish I'd been there. But other than that, I wouldn't have got to Ireland if I'd gone on the court.
Let me turn to that. Your years there were simply amazing, and you dealt with a number of remarkable larger-than-life figures: John Hume, Jerry Adams, Ian Paisley, David Trimble, Bertie Ahern, John Major. Could you say something about a couple of those individuals and your interactions over time?
Yes. Well, first off, the context is that this is a conflict that had gone on for a very long time. Many historians trace it to the original British domination of Ireland, which occurred 800 years ago. The modern effort took place in the 20th century when Ireland achieved its independence from Britain in 1922, but because of a dispute, a so-called temporary border was established, leaving the 6 counties in the north of Ireland, which were majority Protestant, as part of the United Kingdom with England and Wales and Scotland. As often happens in life, they couldn't resolve the differences, and the temporary became the permanent. And the conflict had flared up and then went into remission, flared up and went into remission. I spent 5 years there. I chaired 3 separate sets of negotiations, and I dealt with each of the men you mentioned. In the end, the political leaders of Northern Ireland, ordinary men and women, with all the failings that each of us has, rose to the occasion and reached agreement that was extremely difficult for them. Some of them, basically, their careers ended. But they did the right thing. Maybe there was a mixture of reasons, some good reasons, some not so good reasons, but they did it. And what it demonstrated to me was that there is no such thing as a conflict that can't be ended. Conflicts are conducted, created, sustained by human beings. They can be ended by human beings. If the circumstances align, and it was a near thing in Northern Ireland, very close. I get a lot of praise, President Clinton, but it really were the men and women of Northern Ireland and their political leaders who rose to the occasion in a close-run thing and finally got it done. And David Trimble, who was a unionist leader, lost his position because he made the compromises. John Hume's party, the Social Democratic and Labor Party, went into a long decline. Having been the majority Catholic party, is now the minority Catholic party. Others suffered. 2 of the delegates to the talks were assassinated during the talks. A lot of an overlay of violence and difficulty, but in the end, they were great men and women. Ordinary people. Everybody has greatness in them if the circumstances are such, and they have a chance to prove it.
Let me turn to a very different arena, that of American sports. You've been deeply involved with the Penn State matter.
Yeah.
And what's your view of collegiate athletics today? Is it a good thing, a bad thing?
Overall, a very good thing. Sports teaches us good lessons in life, teamwork, working together, learning to accept loss. Anybody who is an active athlete in any sport suffers losses. Nobody wins them all. I do think that an improper balance has developed with the emphasis on big-time sports that has, I think, at least detracted from, if not overwhelmed, the benefits that come from sports. A lot of the criticism, I believe, is unfounded. There's a lot of talk about the criticism of the NCAA, for example, and all of this big money that goes in. Well, as you know, and as many people don't know, that money goes to support athletics other than football on college campuses. Penn State, for example, has 31 varsity sports, so that hundreds, in the aggregate, thousands of young people get to participate in sports on the intercollegiate level who wouldn't otherwise have the opportunity to do it. So it's like much else in life. There's benefit and disadvantage, good and bad. I think there is an overemphasis on the major sports in the big schools, and I think a much more dramatic effort must be made to right the balance. But I don't think that one can or should indict the whole aspect of intercollegiate sports. I think it's a healthy, effective, important life lesson for people to stay in sports. And I get married after I left the Senate, and so I had children late in life. I've got 2 teenage kids. And I hope that they're in high school now and they participate in sports, and I hope when they go to college they'll participate in sports if they keep it in the proper balance. Mm-hmm. That's the key. It's like everything else in life, the right balance. A virtue carried to extreme can become a vice. You have to find the right balance. I think it's somewhat out of balance now.
Yeah. Thank you. You were someone who always worked across the aisle and sought pragmatic compromise. It seems that our political life has fewer of those citizens, but do you have hope that we can solve some of our major national problems?
Yes, I do. First, when I was elected Senate Majority Leader by the Democrats, who then were in the majority, the first person I called was Bob Dole, the Republican Senate Leader. And I went to see him. I said that I've only been there a few years. I'd only been there a short time. He'd been there for decades. I said, you know a lot more about the Senate than I do, but I've been here long enough to know these are very tough jobs, and that we can't succeed and the Senate can't operate if we don't have trust between us. So I said to him, I'm here to tell you how I intend to behave towards you and to ask you to behave toward me in the same way. And I laid out the most simple, basic standards of fairness, decency, and courteous conduct. He was delighted. We shook hands. To this moment, not once ever has a harsh word passed between Bob Dole and me, although for 6 years I was a Senate Majority Leader, he was a Minority Leader. We disagreed almost every day on the issues, but it was never personal, and we always recognized that our highest loyalty was not to our political parties, but to the Senate as an institution and the people of this country. That's out of kilter a little bit now. There are many reasons, too complicated to go into, too much money in politics, way, way too much money in politics, corrupting our system. It has corrupted our system. I'm going to ask a question now, which I ask all over America. How many of you believe that members of Congress are more responsive to their constituents than they are to their financial donors? I've asked that question all over America, businesses, everything. In all that time, one person has raised her hand. It happened 6 months ago in Washington. A woman raised her hand. And afterwards, I went and spoke to her. I said, I don't want to embarrass you. You're the only person in America who's ever raised your hand. So I feel I got to ask you why. She said, oh, it's simple. My husband's a member of Congress. The only one. That has severed the bond of trust between the elected, the people, and those they elect. It isn't that I urge all of you to try to read the decision by the Supreme Court in Citizens United. First place, you can't get through it. It's illogical, poorly written, unbelievably bad decision. But what it does, it says that the only corruption that they're concerned with is what they call quid pro quo corruption, the overt act. If you will vote yes on this bill, I'll give you $100,000 in cash. The truth is that doesn't happen that often. What really happens is the corrosive effect of the belief among the public that it does happen, or it happens in more subtle ways. And that's dangerous for democracy. But I think we'll overcome it just like we've overcome everything else. I am a dissenter from the current wisdom that the United States is in decline, that we're going to be eclipsed by China. We are about to embark on a period of economic growth that will sustain and extend our dominance for decades to come. You young people are going to live through the greatest period of American history, not the worst. And we'll overcome this problem just like we have with others. Someone asked me yesterday, a reporter at a function, well, Congress is dysfunctional. It doesn't work. And I asked her, what is the standard by which you are measuring Congress's performance? What are the metrics by which we measure whether government is succeeding or not? Go back and look at the objectives of the men who wrote the Constitution. What were their objectives? The primacy of individual liberty, the rule of law applied equally to all, opportunity for all. By those standards, we've done very well. Too many people have this rose-colored view of the past. Oh, wasn't it wonderful 50 or 100 years ago? It wasn't wonderful 50 or 100 years ago. When the Constitution was adopted, every African-American person was considered to be 3/5 of a person. How wonderful was it for them? Women couldn't vote until just 100 years ago. 75 years it took for women to gain the right to vote. How wonderful was it for them? Until we passed the Americans with Disabilities Act when I was in the Senate, disabled persons could not lead, didn't have the opportunity to lead lives of independence and opportunity. And we're still struggling with the issue of gender and sexual orientation. This is a much better, much freer, much more prosperous country than it's ever been, full of human imperfections, full of things that go wrong, but willing to tackle wrong and right the errors of the past. I think we've got a great prospect ahead. We didn't get where we are by whining and cringing and saying, oh, things are terrible, oh, woe is me. Keep this in mind, all of you. From the dawn of civilization, people have feared change. Men and women have preferred the status quo because they feared the future. I don't have it with me, but I can quote almost verbatim words that say something like, men of faith are no more, God is gone, nobody's word can be trusted, traditional values are being lost. I read the quote and I ask people to try to think who said it. Well, those words were written in the year 550 BC. 5 centuries before the birth of Christ, the Greek city-states were passing through a transition from dictatorship to oligarchy to democracy. It was written by an oligarch who regarded democracy, ordinary people participating in self-governance, as being an evil thing and an erosion of traditional values. The fact is, the past is never as good as we think it was, and the future is never as bad as we think it's going to be. And so you young people, you go out, you've got a great future ahead of you in the greatest country in the world, and don't let anybody tell you any different.
Thank you. I want to open the floor now for questions, and let me give preference to students. There will be 2 microphones, so please don't hesitate. Could you come to the mic, please?
Is it on? Hi, thank you so much for coming today. It's been an honor to hear you speak. My name is Melanie Romley, and I'm in the MA in Management program here at Wake Forest. And I have a quick question for you. Would you agree that there's currently a shortage of ethical public policy leaders today? And what advice would you give to our millennial generation if we want to be the strong and ethical leaders of tomorrow? What advice would you give us that we can start doing today?
My advice is pretty simple. It is natural for human beings to want success, defined variously as fame, status, fortune, the acquisition of good things in life. You will all seek one or more of those things. Many of you will attain them. But the more of those you attain, the more you will come to realize that there's much more to life. And the greatest reward is if each of you is fortunate enough to find in your life a cause larger than your self-interest to which you can devote yourself spiritually, physically, and in every other way. So, success, yes. Don't be ashamed of it. Be aggressive. Work hard. But remember, helping others is the ultimate reward. And you'll all succeed. Because let's face it, this is a very elite audience. This is a tiny sliver of humanity. And you have privileges that the overwhelming majority of people in our society and beyond don't have. We pride ourselves in the United States on the aspiration of opportunity for all, even as we know that it is not yet a reality.
Right.
It is an aspiration, and we have to do better at making it available to all. But that, I think, is the challenge that everyone faces. And you don't have to run for office. You don't have to serve in any public position. There's 1,000 ways that you can help and help others and improve the society. I just close with one other story. I was 16 years old when I graduated from high school. I had never been anywhere. My parents didn't own a car. And I was lucky enough to get into Bowdoin College, a fine, small school in Maine. My father, who was not a communicative man, we never had what you'd think of as a father and son talk. The night before I left to go to Bowdoin, he said, I just want to tell you two things. He said, you're very lucky to be going to college. Don't you ever forget how lucky you are. And then he said, look at me. Look at your mother. He said, don't ever forget where you came from. So that's what I'd say to all of you. You're all very lucky. Don't forget where you came from.
Great. Thank you so much.
Hi, my name's Gracie Harrington. I'm a senior here. Thank you so much for being here. Your words are incredibly inspiring.
Thank you.
So something that I wanted to ask is about your role as being a public official. And what did you do when you were kind of this goes on back to ethics, but when your constituents wanted something that you did not agree with or that you felt was ethically wrong?
Yeah. We live in a representative democracy. I represented the people of Maine. But I think Edmund Burke said it best when he said the diligent elected official owes to his constituents his best judgment, not slavish attention to whatever issue they want. The truth is, it's a little more complicated in reality. And what I found in my life was that there is a spectrum of issues. If I were confronted with a deeply, strongly, morally held belief, I felt that I had to act in accordance with that, notwithstanding the views of my constituents. I did have such an example. I am opposed to the death penalty. I spent much of my adult life in the American judicial system. It is the best that human beings have been able to devise, but that's a very low bar. It's filled with human error, and I've seen enough of the system to believe that the death penalty disadvantages of the death penalty outweigh any possible advantages. A significant majority of my constituents did not feel that way. But I stuck with my position because I believed it, and I explained it in those terms. I gave a somewhat longer answer on my reasons, but that was it. On the other hand, there's a very large number of issues that arise in public which don't have any particular moral connotation to them. Should I vote on a bill on a certain program or not? And the further on the spectrum it got away from deeply held moral convictions, the greater I gave account to the views of my constituents. But what you find is all people and constituents hold and advocate contrary views all the time. I mean, I would regularly get people come in and say to me, Senator, 65% of the people of Maine feel you should vote yes. You represent us, vote yes. 2 months later, the same bunch will be back and say, Senator, we recognize only 30% favor this position, but what this country needs are men and women who have the courage to stand up against the tide of public opinion. And so you should vote no on this thing. People hold and advocate contrary views. In the end, what I think the public most looks for is integrity and constancy. That is, some degree of consistency in the application of values. And they know I cast 6,000 or 7,000 votes. There's no human being alive is going to agree with me on every vote. They know that. They understand it. They want, generally, someone who can explain it. So I work very hard. I returned to Maine every weekend, almost every weekend that I could in the Senate, and I did every weekend before I became Majority Leader. I held open meetings. When I was desperate and 36 points behind in the polls, I publicized a policy that I later caused me some problems. I offered to have a private meeting with any citizen of Maine who wanted to have a private meeting with me. First few years, there weren't too many takers. But when I got to be Senate Majority Leader, the lines were very long. But I would go and spend weekends. I gave 10 minutes to every person who wanted to talk with me personally. I had an aide with me to make notes and make sure. I took a lot of flack. A lot of it was wasted, but nonetheless, everybody knew they could speak with me. And I was able to explain myself and therefore retain support. So, and most everybody attaches the moral label to everything that they advocate. But after it's trial and error. You get to make categories, you get to think things through, and you know where you can, it's not really a moral issue, and if you can yield to people's views or not. On some issues you can't. If your conscience and your judgment tell you something is wrong, then you have to do the right thing, no matter the consequences. Thank you.
I'm Erin Curry, and I'm a junior. You've touched on this with your story about Senator Dole, but while you were Senate Majority Leader, you passed the Americans with Disabilities Act, and I was curious as to how important bipartisan work was to the passage of that act and how you facilitated discussions kind of from other sides of the political party.
It was intensely bipartisan. Senator Dole led the effort on the Republican side. Senator Tom Harkin of Iowa led the effort on the Democratic side. I was very active. As the Majority Leader, of course, I scheduled legislation. I decided what we considered and when, and I was very active in supporting the bill. It was not without its drawbacks. There have been, I must say to you, unintended and adverse consequences as a result of it. It's been exploited by some unscrupulous lawyers and some unscrupulous litigants. It's caused, in some cases, unnecessary expense and hardship. Very few human actions are all perfect and without error. On balance, it's been a tremendous thing for our country, and it has enabled millions of our fellow citizens for the first time to have the opportunity to live full, independent lives, notwithstanding their handicap or disability.
Hi, Senator. My name is Tyler Gaetano. I'm a senior. I know you best for your work with Major League Baseball, and I was wondering if you could just talk about what the biggest challenges of the whole report were and what you found most rewarding about it.
Yes. On the steroids investigation.
Yeah.
Well, I had a problem right at the outset. The Commissioner of Baseball asked me to conduct the investigation, but he did not consult with the Players Association or the players, either on the investigation or on me heading it. So the players were uniformly, strongly, adamantly opposed to the investigation and to me. They did not cooperate in any way. I approached I tried to contact, and I ultimately sent a memorandum to every one of the 1,200 Major League players asking to see me. Only 2 talked to me. One of them, voluntarily and publicly, the only one, Frank Thomas, later went into the Hall of Fame. He told me that steroids were widespread. He felt he had been placed at a competitive disadvantage because he didn't take them, and he wanted that known. One other player contacted me with a private lawyer. He said that the Players Association had urged him not to talk to me, but he consulted. His wife insisted he talk to a private lawyer. He admitted that he had purchased steroids, but he claimed he had never used them. He provided us information. We conducted an independent investigation and concluded that he was telling the truth, so I did not name him in the report, and his name has never been public. Other than that, none of them would talk to me. But we got information from 2 sources. First, there are 1,200 men on Major League Baseball rosters. They are members of the Players Association. The instant that they leave the roster, retirement, any other reason, they're no longer members of the association. Many of those former players, and former like a week old, got in touch with us because they were angry. They felt that their careers had been cut short because they refused to cheat, and they felt that they had to compete with players who did cheat, and they wanted to talk. So I got a lot of information from men who had just recently been major leaguers, but were not anymore. The second was a long, complicated story, too complicated to tell here. I worked out an arrangement with the U.S. Attorney's Office in San Francisco, which was prosecuting a group of players, the most notable one being Barry Bonds, whereby they made available to me 2 men who were distributors of drugs. And they provided a great deal of information based on their personal activities, corroborated by letters, canceled checks, a whole lot of evidence. And so while I did not name in my report every player about whom I received an allegation, because I made the decision that I would not name a player publicly unless I had a reasonably secure amount of corroborating information. We ended up naming 90 players. More importantly, that's what got the attention. But the real substance of the report were the recommendations that we made for baseball to improve their processes. And I must say, to their credit, they have done so. And I will say the players have undergone a 180-degree reversal of their position. Today, the Major League players and their association are strongly for drug testing, strongly for stiff punishment for those who cheat. In 10 years, they've gone completely from a position of adamant opposition to strong support, and I think it's to their great credit. And baseball now does have, by far, the best and strongest program of any professional sport in our country.
Thank you.
Okay.
Hi, Senator. First, I want to thank you for coming to our campus today and speaking. It's truly an honor. My question is, first, are you aware of the new No Labels Congressional Caucus? And my second question is, so you mentioned Citizens United, you mentioned lobbyist groups. I'm wondering, what do you think the role of a bipartisan advocacy lobby group in Congress, like what their role should be, what the potential impact in the current political climate it could have?
Yeah.
And I will tell you the reason why I'm asking is because some friends of mine here on campus were trying to bring a No Labels college chapter here, and I'm wondering if you could provide some advice to a moderate college student.
Yeah. I confess I don't know much about the No Labels part of it. I assume it's not aligned with either party, and they want to make it. I don't know about it.
No, so it's a bipartisan advocacy group headed by former Governor John Huntsman and Joe Manchin,
Yeah.
and they advocate for bipartisan legislation.
Yeah. Well, it's similar to the Bipartisan Policy Center, which is a nonprofit organization that I helped create with Senator Dole, Senator Howard Baker, and Senator Tom Daschle, 4 former Senate leaders, 2 Democrats and 2 Republicans, in which we analyze current issues, issue reports with recommendations, We don't engage in extensive lobbying. We do appear before relevant congressional committees to testify on our bills, but we don't go beyond that in lobbying. I really don't know too much. I know very little about the others, so I'm afraid I can't comment on that.
Thank you.
Thank you again for coming, Senator. My name's Paul Wistemeyer. I'm a third-year medical student here. I was wondering what you consider to be the biggest obstacle to healthcare reform efforts in the 90s, and how we might be able to apply any lessons you might have learned to our current efforts.
Yeah. It's a tremendously important, large, and complex issue. Our healthcare system comprises a large part of our national economy. There are literally trillions of dollars involved, and a very large number of individuals and groups with deeply held interests in it. The legislative process does not lend itself to tackling issues of that type. And so it's very hard to compress into a single piece of legislation all that's necessary to do. And given the political dynamics in the country, in order to pass a bill, you have to make so many compromises that often what holds it together is lost. However, I think that it's unmistakably clear that the cost of our system is unsustainable over time. We're all familiar with the gory details, and I won't go into them. There are dramatic articles in the newspaper every day. Just yesterday, the New York Times had a big front page story on a man who was operated on, and he received bills several $100,000, including from people who he'd never met, never talked to, didn't know they were involved, and he got a bill in the hundreds of thousands of dollars. We spend a hugely disproportionate amount of our national resources in healthcare with results that are not commensurate with the amount that we're spending. I would need a couple of hours, you can invite me back another year, to give the diagnosis of the overall problem. But I will conclude with this. We have a free market system. It's an economic transaction. But it is unlike every other economic transaction in our system. If any of you buy a car, you go out and you shop. You say to the guy, what's the price? If you buy a house, if you buy a pair of shoes, if you buy a suit, if you buy anything. But when you decide to go to the doctor, especially if you have a sick child, you don't even think about price. It is an extraordinary economic circumstance in which the seller dictates what the buyer will buy. Wouldn't you like to be an automobile dealer who dictated what the buyer should purchase? And paradoxically, the more the seller loads on in the form of testing, the more reassured the buyer feels. Well, how about this CAT scan? How about that test? How about this and that? So it can't be viewed as exclusively an economic transaction in a free market economy, because the economic underpinnings of an arm's length transaction between a buyer and a seller doesn't exist in terms of health care. And as a result, we have a third of surgical procedures in the United States are either unnecessary or produce no beneficial result. 1/3. And so the whole system, I think, has been skewed. The bottom line, in my judgment, is that in the 21st century, in this, the greatest and wealthiest country in the world, in a society in which access is dictated in significant degree by the presence or absence of insurance, no American should be denied adequate care because they don't have insurance. And so we ought to insure everybody in our country, the least as well as. I'll tell you I'll close this with a very moving story. When we were involved in the health care effort, when I was in the Senate, I went to Tampa, Florida, and I visited the Tampa General Hospital. And they took me through and as I walked through the pediatric ward, the doctor accompanying me pointed to a row of incubators along the wall. She said, "Those are our $1 million babies." I said, "What do you mean?" She took me over. Each of those infants was born prematurely. Each of them had received more than $1 million of care to keep them alive, to keep them going. Knowing I was coming, the hospital had invited the mothers to come in. Uniformly, they were young, minority, uneducated, and the vast majority of them had not seen a doctor between the moment of conception and the moment of birth. The vast majority of them. Now, I have 2 daughters. Until that moment, it was unthinkable to me that an American woman should become pregnant and never see a doctor until the baby was born, and I'll bet it's unthinkable to every person in this room. And yet there are across America hundreds of thousands of young American women who are in exactly that position. And they don't have $1 million to pay, so we all pay. The people who buy insurance and the people who are fortunate enough to be able to pay their bills on their own. It's an investment in our future. If every one of those mothers received the most basic prenatal care, if the children could have, the pregnancy could continue to term so the children weren't born 1.5 pounds, 2 pounds prematurely, and these heroic measures weren't needed, they would lead individual better lives, and we would all benefit because they would be productive members of society. As it is, every one of them starts out with 2.5 strikes against them. So we all benefit. And I just think that it's common sense to adapt our system to the needs of our society in a way that makes basic care available to all and reduces the extraordinary degree of unnecessary and wasteful care that's afforded in our country. That's not to say, I have to say, the skills are there. We have the best medical personnel in the world, brilliant doctors, men and women all across the country, nurses and others. But we have to do a better job at sizing the system to the needs and deploying those skills at an expense that doesn't bankrupt the country.
Thank you very much.
Hi, my name is CJ Dickman, and I'm a sophomore here, and I am on the executive board for College Republicans, so you and I certainly don't agree on a lot of issues. But over the summer, I worked with Congressman Frank Wolf very closely on Capitol Hill, and we had various conversations about some struggles that he's been through in his long career with bipartisanship. So my question for you is, what is the biggest, or what was the biggest struggle for you in bipartisanship efforts, and how did you apply your leadership skills in dealing with those issues?
Well, let me say I know Frank very well. He's a terrific guy, and I'm sorry he's leaving because he has been an exemplar of bipartisanship and always willing to work with others. Frank created a bipartisan commission to review the U.S. relationship with the United Nations, and he asked Newt Gingrich and I to chair it, which we did, and we worked out a reasonable compromise with Frank's guidance and support. There isn't any easy answer to this. It's never been polite and nice. A scholar from the University of Maine recently published a series of articles describing the presidential election of 1800. Two of the great heroes of our country. John Adams was the incumbent president. Thomas Jefferson was a challenger. You wouldn't believe what they said about each other back then. I mean, it was brutal, far more than now. Of course, there wasn't television. It was newsprint, read by only a few, distant in time. And so it didn't have the emotional impact that the electronic media has with the incessant negative television advertising spot. While I was in the Senate, I teamed up with former Senator David Boren of Oklahoma, now the president of the University of Oklahoma, and we passed a major campaign reform bill. Unfortunately, President Bush vetoed it. We couldn't override the veto. I think that there has to be a greater restraint on money in politics. I think this notion of opening it wide open is catastrophic for the country. Members of Congress spend hugely disproportionate amounts of time raising money. And it deprives them of the opportunity to do their job, and as I said earlier, it severed the bond of trust between the people. So I think there have to be found ways to limit the supply of money. I sincerely believe, many will disagree, that the Citizens United decision will be seen historically as one of the worst decisions by any Supreme Court in our history. It basically poured gasoline on a fire that had already been burning out of control. And I think that's a first essential step. Beyond that, I don't think we're ever going to get to the stage where it's all sweetness and light. It's never been that way. It won't be. But controlled competition, I think, in parallel with cooperation when appropriate, is still the best system. You know, nobody wants to eliminate political competition. Our economic system, sports, everything is a judicial system based on the notion that competition produces the best results. So we have competition in politics, and we should continue to have it. We should have differing parties and differing points of view. Where the line is between constructive cooperation and destructive competition is very hard to draw, and I think that takes leaders of integrity and, I hate to say it again, a willingness to understand that their primary responsibility is not to their party, but to their country and to the institution that they serve.
Thank you.
Let's take one last question.
Uh-oh.
Hello, my name is Johnny Huan, an international student from China, and I know you have been successful in many crises around the world. So I assume that you know the recent conflict in Hong Kong and China. So I just wonder, is there anything you learned from your past resolution of crisis that you think you can apply to the recent conflict in China and Hong Kong?
Yes. By complete coincidence, I spent all last week in China, including in Hong Kong. I left the day before the demonstration started. I thought they were protesting because I was leaving, but I guess they weren't. Let me say that I'm a great admirer of the Chinese people. I think they have a long, distinguished history. They are tremendously entrepreneurial, skillful, close family structures. But I do not agree with the political system that now exists there. The most revolutionary thing about the American Revolution was that it established a principle which has become universal in the relatively short time of a couple of centuries, that the only legitimate source of authority for any government is the consent of the governed. That was not the case in the thousands of years of human history prior to that. It now is everywhere. You're from China, and I've been there many times. I've yet to meet a communist. They're all entrepreneurs. The ideology is no longer a matter of belief. It's sort of a superstructure under which they operate, but the belief is in economic improvement. And I think the principal source of legitimacy of the current regime is that it is producing economic growth, opportunity, and rising standards of living for the people. That's a good thing. A principal reason for that is access to the American market. So I don't think they're going to jeopardize their economic future by taking actions that would cause them to lose access to our market. And we, in turn, of course, get financial support through their purchase of our bonds to take care of our profligacy when we spend beyond our means. In 1985, when Gorbachev took power in the Soviet Union, I was one of a small group of senators invited to meet with him. We went to Moscow. The subject was nuclear arms reduction, but it was a wide-ranging discussion. And I said to Gorbachev, I asked him, do you believe that you can give the people of the Soviet Union free choice in economic affairs while continuing to deny it to them in political affairs. He answered indirectly. He said, I believe the Communist Party can be reformed from within. He was wrong. Yeltsin, who was not Gorbachev's equal in intellect or anything else, understood the politics better. And he said, communism has to be completely swept away and replaced by something else. Will China be able to do what Russia could not do? Can China continue to deny access to independent action in political affairs, have a one-party state, while opening it up in economic affairs? I personally don't think so, but only time will tell. I think it's likely to be a gradual evolution with crises along the way, like Hong Kong, like Tiananmen, and like others, because freedom is a funny thing. You give people a little bit of it, and they don't say thank you. They say, I want more. And I think that's the problem that China's going to face, and they face it severely. Now, I will say, somewhat in their defense, we and others in the Western world preach to them about democracy. The British were in Hong Kong for 150 years. They discovered democracy 5 years before they left. And they're now giving sermons to the Chinese about they ought to be democratic. We got to be careful about preaching to others. But I think they're going to have a difficult time getting out of this because the leader does not want to look weak, but the young people of Hong Kong are pretty determined. You've seen the scenes on the street, and they're going to hold the Chinese government to their commitment in terms of free and open elections, which really aren't the case. If the government can choose the candidates, you don't have a free election. That's what Iran has. People go vote, but they can only vote for people that the government presents. That's nobody's definition of democracy. So I think they're going to succeed in continuing to improve their economy. It's an economic miracle. They have a tremendous problem of pollution, a tremendous problem. In Beijing, I was there 2 days. Everybody's got a mask on. You can't see 200 yards, all the pollution. I never saw the sun 1 second while I was there. They've got to deal with that and a number of other issues. But I think on balance, we should not assume conflict, but rather should conduct ourselves in a way that promotes reasonable competition in the economic sphere. It's a good thing China's coming into the World Trade Organization and others. They will have to adapt to universal standards. And I think that we can coexist, although I think China has many problems. They don't have the rule of law. They don't have an independent judiciary. Those are important for individual liberty and business investment. They're surrounded by countries that don't like them. We're the only major power in the world that has two countries with which we're on friendly relations. Nobody in Canada loses a night's sleep worrying about they're going to be invaded by the U.S. All of China's neighbors, except North Korea and now Russia, are hostile to it and worried about what they're doing. So they have a lot of problems at home. We have a lot of problems at home. I think we can coexist, but I think the United States will remain the dominant power throughout the remainder of this century. Thank you very much. Thank all of you very much.
Let me just say again how honored we are to have you at Wake Forest, and thank you for your tremendous public service.
That's great. I got to say, you got a tough battle this weekend. Go Deacons.
Thank you. Thank you all.